Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so I guess we can get started. Welcome everyone to NE's second training in a 4-part series for the Family Supports Funding Opportunities. My name is Kim Grippa, and I'm the Executive Director of NE. Please welcome Sam Kimmelman and Jalen Darling, 2 members of my team who will be doing conducting future training sessions and also holding office hours. Today, we are very fortunate to have Professor David Berlin of the FSU Askew School of Public Administration and Policy to lead the logic model and data collection training. As usual, the PowerPoints and recordings from today's session will be posted on NE's webpage. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will address them at the end of this session. So please welcome Professor David Berlin.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to share this session with you. As Kim mentioned, we're going to be covering logic models in this session and some of the sort of associated pieces that allow that to happen. I'm an associate professor and the MPA program director for the Askew School of Public Administration and Policy. And there I'm our primary nonprofit management scholar. So I teach a lot of coursework in nonprofit management and sort of the related areas of expertise to it. But I also have significant practical experience in this area. I've sat on both sides of what you're going through now. When working for nonprofits, I was involved in a lot of grant writing. I think the grants I wrote brought in over $1 million, and I was a co-author on probably a similar amount. And I've since also served at a community foundation and at another grant-making organization, evaluating applications and being involved in sort of that decision-making into things. So the structure of today, I'm going to start with a presentation, sort of a very more typical lecture approach. But please feel free, throw questions into the chat. If you need to stop and interrupt me, I am perfectly flexible, good on my toes, sort of responding to questions as we go. In fact, if I'm not getting any questions, it might signal to me that I'm not making myself clear enough or covering what you really need to know. So I'm going to cover basically 4 aspects around it, with most of the attention around logic models. So I'll briefly talk about how you think about performance management systems, talk about theories of change, which are often used as an alternative to a logic model, cover logic models in some detail, and then open up sort of what program evaluation looks like, how you think about that, how you make that work for your organizations. I plan to then have a worked example of how you would go through the steps of developing a logic model. And if we're sort of ahead of schedule or time permits, we'll do some sort of initial discussion, brainstorming how you would do that for your own programs and organizations. So first, when we're thinking about performance management system, which is what leads you to develop a logic model, what allows you to track the things you need on it, the first is really to figure out what you're trying to accomplish with it. How large is it going to, what aspects of your work are you focusing it on? Do you have support from your leadership, from your board, from those who will be involved in it? Think about sort of what this system is trying to accomplish, who the clients are. And just as a hint, your clients are not just the funders you're applying to for this grant program. The people who will use the performance management system, if you do it right, are your staff. It may be your clients even, or the community that you're serving. It will be multiple funders. It'll be your board. And so broadly thinking about who's going to be able to use this, we often want to think about what's measurable, what we can capture, what perhaps we're not capturing yet, but we could capture relatively easily. And then keep in mind sort of the things that aren't measurable, but are also important to us. Identify our data sources and collection protocols, then start figuring how do we compare our data, right? What are we comparing what we found to? And then of course, sort of as with anything you start to roll out, you pilot test it, and then you roll it out for implementation. And that's generally how you would build this in. And the logic model is a lot of these different pieces in there, and we'll cover what those look like. But the first one, and this is a little bit less common, I think a logic model often gets pushed very frequently by funders, consultants, trainers. A theory of change is introduced a little bit less frequently. But the easiest way to think about a theory of change is this is the story that you tell of how you achieve what your mission is, what you're trying to do with your programming, how you're trying to serve your clients and your community and your cause. And it's really about being able to comprehensively and effectively tell that story. When we're thinking about a theory of change, we need to think about all of our assumptions. What are we assuming about the people we serve? What are we assuming about what needs to happen, about how this program functions, how everything works? What are the interventions that we are providing and that others are providing as well? And then what are the indicators of success? What are the things we're seeking to achieve or to make happen? And for us to build an effective theory of change, it requires identification of all necessary changes, including the actions of others and societal changes. So that's probably not super clear. So let me use as an example this very training session, right? So the theory of change for this training session is going to start with assumptions that you're here to learn about it, right? Learn about how to build logic models, how to build theories of change, how to improve or sort of rethink or tinker with your performance management and evaluation approaches. And that's a fundamental assumption, right? It's perfectly reasonable and possible that some of you just want to satisfy the funder because you're already happy with your systems, you already have an approach to it, but you realize you're going to have to create a logic model for this proposal, and that sort of would satisfy in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. The intervention here is first this training, but it's also going to be you yourselves going out and building these logic models, building these systems, analyzing yours, talking through them, thinking about them. The sort of basic indicator of success would be that, yes, you're able to submit the logic model as part of your application. More advanced indicators might be that the logic model either helps you think about how you're approaching your work, or thinks about maybe a more efficient way of collecting information about how you're doing your work. It may be successful in supporting applications, this funder or to others. And so then the narrative of change is not that I'm going to be responsible for much of what you're accomplishing, a little bit of it, right? I'm going to share some information about what these models look like, how to think about them, how to design them. But most of the work that makes the change happen comes from you. And you'll notice that with a lot of your own programming too, right? You provide really key interventions, but it's your clients and their networks of support and the community around them that is also sort of absolutely essential for the changes that you want to have happen. And that's what a theory of change does, is it opens us up and sort of presents, it's not just sort of what we change, but what else has to happen, what else is going on. For instance, if we're thinking about a theory of change for a particular program you're applying for funding here, but you have multiple programs that help build some degree of wraparound services, part of your theory of change are that these other programs are also happening, right? This one primary program you're requesting funding for is the critical one you're paying attention to, but your expectations of how you achieve that involves these other aspects as well. This is also something we would use when we're thinking about a logic model. So logic models can get somewhat complicated, although usually they'll start with 4 or 5 main pieces of it, and sometimes those are broken up into the subcategories. We start with inputs, and these are sort of the resources that you have available to use. This is all the types of things that come into what you're going to accomplish, and I'll talk about each of these sort of individually as we go. Those inputs are then used for the activities of the work that you're doing. Sometimes this is also called throughputs, especially in the private sector when they use logic models. But these activities are the actual work that you're doing in your project. Outputs are what happens immediately as a result of your efforts. So the things you can capture at the end of a session or the end of a treatment or sort of as it's happening. Outcomes are what changes for your recipients as a result of participating in your program. And these are usually short to medium term results. What are the things that we're hoping to achieve? How do we hope that somebody is going to improve their life as a result of receiving these services or participating in the program? And then impacts are how we think about how society or the community is changed as a result of your program. And these are usually the long-term changes that you're causing through the programming, through the work that you're doing. So as you can see, these things can get quite a bit more complicated, right? There's the sample logic model that Annie and CSC were sharing of sort of the inputs or resources going into what they're doing to provide capacity, right? So they looked at their own efforts of what they're doing. So they're identifying the people, the funding, the facilities, library of support, the methods, right? These trainings, technical assistance, sub-awards. Then outputs are sort of the things, right? These measurable things that are happening right after. How much time, how many attendees, right? All those things. Short-term, sort of the knowledges, the new capacity. The intermediate outcomes are sort of making changes to your practices, using these things to improve yourself. And then the longer term is sort of the effectiveness and the size and scale of your work. So then if we look through and think through each of these individual pieces, inputs are all the resources we need for our program. When we're identifying these, we want to think about those that are provided by others too. One of the challenges I often see when people are trying to understand or build up a logic model is they only pay attention to the pieces of that programming that they themselves oversee and are responsible for. Right. So internally, you might think about how your organization is providing some staff. You may be providing space or securing it. You may have equipment, finances, right? The financial resources, all of these pieces that you control and that you oversee. But usually other critical inputs might include things like volunteers. You might require some donations or some outside financial support for it to happen. Sponsors of an event or something of that sort. You need client or community engagement and involvement. You need to identify these, right? When we're thinking through our list of inputs, we have to make sure we know everything we need for our programs to happen. When it comes to sharing your logic models, like with a funder, you may leave out these external ones, right? The logic model you share with a funder will probably just focus on your internal ones, but you need to be aware and understand what else you need. This can also be one of the first sort of opportunities for reflection and thinking about how you're doing the work and how you accomplish it. For instance, if we're thinking about the inputs that are needed for our program to be a success, we might realize that one of the inputs we need is we're serving people who are too young to drive themselves. They need transportation to get to our programming. If we haven't built that into our programs, if we don't have a partner who can provide it, if we're not located along a bus route or sort of another easy to access way to get people to our services, this may be a need, like a gap that we're missing in terms of how we effectively provide our services. This is often the type of thing that can also be gleaned from like surveys for people who expressed an interest but then chose not to participate in the service. There are examples where we have great programs, they're well intended, and there isn't enough uptake. There may be inputs that are missing or things that allow people to participate that we just didn't recognize or didn't think about. And so this first step of thinking about what else needs to happen outside of your organization to even start things going is critical. I'd also caution you when we're thinking about a program, right? If we're thinking about providing a program that serves clients, serves a community, we don't want to think about things like securing donations or recruiting volunteers or getting funding for it as outcomes. We want to treat those as inputs that allow the program to happen. It would be a different story if you were creating a logic model for, say, a fundraising event. Then you're going to be thinking about the funding you received as an outcome, right? So when we're designing a logic model, the perspective of when something is an input versus when it's an outcome is going to vary depending on what exactly we're trying to capture and what we're trying to measure. So the second thing, and usually this is the easiest, are the activities of your organization, of your program, the actual work that you're doing. what it is specifically that you are doing. So what are you and your collaborators doing in order to serve your clients and pursue your mission? Again, you may want to think about sort of if there are others who are helping provide this service, who are helping make it happen, we need to identify those as well. That may be a collaboration with partners. It might be a subcontract or a subgrantee. Usually with those, you're going to keep them in your logic model, right? Is if it's work that's being done by somebody that's being paid from the same program, that's under your supervision, that should show up in it. With partners or collaborators, again, you may omit it when you're sort of applying for funding and sharing that logic model because you want to focus on your organization as the primary actor and sort of what piece of this you're doing. We also want to think about pieces of like co-production by clients, right? What are the activities that we're expecting our clients or those that we serve to be engaged in? Are there things they have to be doing as part of this that are going to fit the category of activities rather than something that's a result of the programming that we're doing? The next one are our outputs. And again, these are usually pretty easy to capture, right? And these are what we can think of as the immediate results of our activities. They're very specific and measurable initial results. We can collect them immediately after or even while providing services, and in some cases even before, right? We can think about registration for events or pre-screening or other things can also be something that help us capture some of this information. Examples of things that count as outputs, we might think about the client served, attendees at a session, the number of items distributed. Again, usually these are things that are going to be relatively easy and quick to count and to capture and to observe. Even for more abstract programs. So even if you were sort of more engaged in an advocacy program, you could still capture outputs, count them quite easily. You could, look at how many people presentations that were given, how many people attended events, how many people signed letters, right? There's all sorts of ways we can think about these immediate things that happen after our activities. The hard part are our outcomes and our impacts, right? Really figuring out how do we know this is working, right? And how can we prove it? We may sometimes divide these up into short-term, medium-term, and long-term. That looks to be the model that the CSC is looking for. And that's a reasonable approach as well, is we want to think about sort of how quickly these happen. There isn't always a clear, clean, quick definition for that short-term, medium-term, and long-term. We're generally thinking about that short-term as probably happening a month, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 after our activities. Medium-term is sort of longer than that, probably up to about a year, sometimes a little bit more. And then long-term is going to be sort of anything well beyond that scope. And again, it will depend on your programs too, right? Some things take, if we think about how long people have to be involved in our programs, how long the activities take, what that theory of change is and what that looks like, that's going to determine what counts as short-term, medium-term, and long-term for our programs. For instance, the research on early childhood education happens for a couple of years, but a lot of the medium and long-term impacts are throughout the rest of the individual participants' time as students and even their early adulthood. The longest term impacts are things that are being observed 20 and 30 and 40 years after the initial program, and studies that have followed up on that really have shown that continues to bear out and continues to have an impact. So these are the results after the activity ends. Usually I think about outcomes and impacts differently by primarily thinking about outcomes more tied to those you specifically did the work on behalf of. So the individuals who participated in your activities, the communities within which they live, the cause that you're pursuing as an organization. If we're thinking about capacity building, you might be thinking about your own organization or the organizations being served. Outcomes will almost always require follow-up data collection, right? This is unlike outputs where we can capture what we did as it's happening. We can capture those immediate outputs sort of right after our activities, basic data collection, sort of even sign-in sheets, things of that sort of allow that to happen. For outcomes, we generally have to find a way to follow up. We have to be able to get information about how our clients are doing or how our community or cause is doing after we've done the work. These often end up being less easily measurable. That's the other piece we have to recognize. We can measure some of it, but we can't measure all of the things that happen. All right, so we have examples, right? Learning sort of be measurable. I'm not completely convinced, even as somebody in a university where we have to accept standardized tests, I'm not convinced that tests capture learning all of the time. Positive feedback on surveys capture, how people feel about your programs, their experience with it, but it can be shaped by how responsive people are, whether or not they answer. Attendance, grades, if you're thinking about students where you have after school programming, have their grades improved, has their attendance in school improved? We could think about things like jobs or housing placement. So a lot of these sort of, usually we're going to measure them in positive terms or in a reduction of negative outcomes. But the basic idea is we're trying to come up with these things that really measure the effect that we're having. The reality is that the measurable things that can be counted, that we can put statistics up there, those tend to be the things that funders ask for when we're applying for government grants, applying to foundations, applying to other institutional supports. But those don't always capture the full picture for us. Sometimes we find those narratives are also effective, right? The stories of how somebody's life was changed. What went on to happen after the fact of participating in your programs, of coming back as an alum to help others and to volunteer. And so we want to make sure sort of that we don't leave these out, that we leave ourselves open to thinking about all of the different ways that we can capture outcomes and report them. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but there's some strategies for how we can think about capturing both at the same time. Right, to both capture the stories and come up with something measurable that allow us to sort of serve multiple interests of hearing about the success stories of our work, or allowing us opportunities to learn from what didn't work. And then impacts are the long-term changes to community or society as a result of programs. Typically, we're going to move beyond the individual level to understand impacts. Even beyond maybe the household or the family level, but often to the community, to the society, to sort of larger things we care about. These typically require research such as evaluations or relying on existing research that's out there. So there are sources of prior research that identify interventions that have proven impacts. We can do that, such as cut off the words, but we could do that through things like clearinghouses of evidence bases, systematic reviews of research, other efforts of that sort allow us to understand when there are things that have proven impacts. This is like the evidence base behind Head Start, of how there have been several very long-term studies of how early childhood education has positive impacts that last long beyond it. When we know that there's an evidence base already, it's a little bit of a shortcut to the impacts we might expect, but then there are always challenges comparing our programs to the type of programs in that original evidence base, comparing those we served to those that have been served to those before. Examples of things we might think about as impacts, reducing those experiencing homelessness, reducing those experiencing food insecurity, increasing graduation rates, reducing crime rates, reducing poverty. So generally, these are often on that scale that, again, tends to be quite measurable in a way that some of those short-term outcomes may not be quite as measurable. The impacts that people pay the most attention, that are able to get us most success and sort of being recognized as having evidence of success, tend to be these measurable impacts that happen at a larger level than just immediate clients of a program or a service. Before I jump on to the next piece, are there any questions about any of these? Anything I can clarify about these 5 key categories in the logic model? So here I'll show you another one that was sort of published of a logic model. Again, it's busy, right? There's a lot going on here. This has actually more pieces than you would be expected in your logic model. But what we have to recognize is when we're building out these logic models, the funder is not the only client. The first client of the logic model, the first user of it, is your organizations and you yourselves. By going through the exercise of building this out, it's an opportunity for reflection and learning. And that's the key piece of anything around performance measurement, performance management, evaluation, logic models, theories of change. The first and most important piece is whether we can learn from this activity, right? Is this something that by us doing, we can learn, reflect on, sort of take that opportunity when everything is squeezing you for your time to think a little bit more deeply about your programs, how they're working, how we want them to work, whether they're successful, whether there are things we can look to try differently, capture differently. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? So in this case, this is an information campaign, right? So it's more advocacy oriented. They laid out first the situation. So basically the context of the issue, lays out the equipment, the inputs that they have. Then they think about who they're targeting before they think about the activities. We're usually going to do both of these at the same time. When we're doing our activities, they're already going to presume who it is that we're serving, who the targets of our activities are. We're usually going to capture that already. But in this case, it was important to them to think about both who they're targeting and what activities they're doing. Then they thought about outputs. So in these cases, they had sort of individual pieces or publications or announcements that they created. And then they looked at short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. What are they saying about quick changes people can make as soon as they hear about it? In this case, awareness was the primary thing. Intermediate were behavior change. And then long-term were like the health outcomes. And in these, they then thought about the sources of data for each of them, right? If we're thinking about awareness, learning, they're going to start with things like focus groups, interviews. When they're trying to look at behavior, they're also doing, in this case, they did some focus groups, but also surveys. And then when they looked at the long-term, they were using national data sources, right? They didn't try to collect it themselves. They looked at what was available and what was out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through how I would create a logic model so that you would see sort of what this would look like, how to function. I'm going to use one of the versions that have been shared with of sort of a template of how to, what a logic model would look like for it. And I'm going to use it just like I'm recommending for you as an opportunity for me to learn by going through this exercise and discussing it with you. Let me go to the... So here I have a blank worksheet of what a logic model could look like. Here, this one has sort of the inputs, outputs have the activities, and then the products separated by each other. And then outcomes, again, are the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And I'm going to use something that will be familiar to some of your organizations, but probably at a very different level of clients. So I'm going to use my teaching as a way of something to evaluate, right? So I teach courses to master's students, so adults who not only have finished their undergraduate before, but are now sort of pursuing a professional master's degree or a doctorate. So I'm going to talk about my master's teaching, right? And so when I think about inputs, I have to think about first, what am I providing, right? So we're going to think about my labor, right? My time, my teaching time, prep time, right? We've got teaching, we've got prep, we've got my own sort of professional development. And then we have to think about the other key things that I'm providing, right? Or that my employer is providing. We've got the technology, right? To be able to hold meetings, space if it's an in-person meeting. And then we think about sort of instruction materials, right? And this would be things like books that I assign, lesson plans that I develop, right? Things of that sort. Slideshows, right? Like this one, right? So sort of the different things I'm going to come up with, I'm going to create. The other inputs are my students' time. right? It's a trickier one, but right, their engagement in preparing for it, engaging in the class, choosing to take it. And then there's all this, other stuff, overhead stuff, that the university makes available, right? Students get assistance when they need things. There are sort of all the support systems that are in place that are the wraparound services that make it work. Right. And it would be too much to sort of detail all of them, so I'll skip past those. But basically sort of the other things that are available that students, when they need them, can access them, that allow them to be in place to participate, to attend. So then if I think about the activities, right, I have sort of the actual class sessions, right? I also have the assignments and grading, right? Feedback and grading. And then I also have the course and assignment prep, right? So sort of the thinking, the preparation I do, everything of that sort. And then I would apply the same to like students' work, right? There's a piece that their work is an activity. So the products of this are going to be things like hours taught, right? They're going to be students participating, or right, attendance and participation. So how many were present, how many were participating, right? That type of thing. We can even think about number and form of assignments as sort of a product that we're looking at. And then the short term, we're going to want to try to assess learning. If I've done things really well, I give an assignment. It shows whether or not students have learned from the class meetings, from the readings that we assigned, and most important, from my perspective, can apply it to practice. So I build into all of the assignments I come up with, whether or not they can tell me how to use it in actual organizations. Right? So we can look at things like assessment of learning. We can look at the student engagement, right? I can do really simple sheets where I track who's participating. I have counters for who uses the Canvas sites. So we can measure the engagement in the short term. And we can even think about sort of grades in the class, right? As a short-term thing that we're looking for. I can even look at sort of as like a negative outcome, students dropping my course, right? Dropping, failing to repeat, to complete. The same thing you would see with when you're serving clients is not all the clients are in a position to succeed at the point in time when you're providing the services to them. And sometimes people drop out, fail to complete it. And we just want to be really careful that we haven't been the cause of that, right? So when I get a short-term outcome of somebody dropping the course, failing to complete it, I will reach out, right? Try to get a feel for what's going on. Whether there's anything I can do that can prevent them, that can keep them to succeed, allow them to finish the course. Medium term, I want to look at the same things at the program level, right? We could look at grades in the program, completion of the master's degree or of the degree, if I can spell, right? I would probably also want to look at job placement. All right, how are my students doing? Have they gotten the promotion they were hoping for? Have they moved to a different job that allows them more responsibility, that allows them to achieve more? We might also want to look back at like connections and engagement with the school, right? I guess, what's the other one? Oh, I guess I do also have things like, for me, yeah, we also have, for me, there's things like teaching evaluations, right? That didn't work. My students' perspective on how effective I was at teaching. So those are all sort of, the teaching evaluation might be short, might be medium, depending how we think about that. But looking at all of these for understanding where we're going, right? And then the long term is here, it's moved beyond the individual students, right? Is I'm really trying to think about, and the whole point of, say, the courses I'm providing are that we're going to have a positive impact down the line, right? So really, I'm looking for stronger nonprofit and public sectors, right? Is the people who've gone through our courses, who've gone through our programs, are contributing so that these organizations are better run, have more capacity, are more effective at what they're doing. But that's probably a less important outcome, right? So we see here, I don't know if this was accidental, but we've got sort of this bolded box. And the real impact here is more and higher quality services, right? The role of a stronger nonprofit and public sector is that we're better serving citizens and communities. So that's what I want to see, right? Is I want to see more and higher quality services. I might also sort of want to perhaps see more positive perceptions of the nonprofit and public sectors, right? Is we want to either sort of, maybe can we turn back some of the negative attention toward the public sector, or try to prevent the receding of the positive feelings and perceptions of the nonprofit sector. And we do that by being better at our jobs, right? Hopefully the students I train, people who've gone through workshops I've held, are able to do their work easier, better, more effectively. And that allows people to then perceive them better because they're having an impact. So what do I have here? There are a few things, right? There's some major assumptions. There are some external factors, right? Is part of it, are there job opportunities available, right? Are my students going to be able to find positions in the public and nonprofit sectors, or are they mostly going to find jobs in consulting firms? And sort of, does that create a challenge for them? Right, assumptions, right? Can we find affordable ways to complete programs, right? Do we keep our tuition low enough? Are there enough forms of aid available? Are there opportunities for assistantships, for waivers, for other things of that sort? Are the students here to learn rather than get a piece of paper, right? So we often have that dynamic is people may want a degree because it meets a career objective or a requirement and may not really be here to learn. That's going to limit my impact, right? And so I'm operating with an assumption, and I'm going to treat all of my students like they're committed to learning. Because even if they just came here because they need that credential for work, I'm going to give them every opportunity possible so that they can learn, they can find value for themselves, they can make it work for themselves, right? And I can even think about sort of things like, maybe even like things about practice relevance of assignments, right? I can think about, can I assess them for whether this is something that's helping, that's relevant to people's work. So this is how I would build out a logic model for myself, right? For the work I'm doing myself. The next thing I would do is I would try to figure out which of these do I already have access to information about, right? This one's a little trickier, right? The assessment of learning, I can look at grades, sure, right? And I'll have my rubrics available. I have ways I look at those. The grades will tell me one thing, right? Are they doing the things necessary? Is it the format we want? Are they sort of engaging the work the right way? In terms of how I actually assess whether people are learning, that's through reading it qualitatively, right? When I read their work, are they making these useful connections to practice? Is this something that I can really understand? Student engagement, I can capture some of that myself. I do it, I keep it as I'm teaching. So all these short-term things, I can capture pretty easily. The product's very easy to capture, right? Longer term outcomes in the program, completion of degree, I'm reliant on the university's tracking system to do that. Job placement, honestly, I've had to go LinkedIn stalking to check on sort of where our students are, whether they've advanced, where they're working now. We can look about connections and engagement with school, capture that pretty easy. The teaching evaluations we can capture super easy because the university builds it in. I don't have a lot of faith in them, but there's still something that's available. These other pieces, the impacts here, these are harder for me to measure. I can look at studies others are doing about perceptions of the sectors. I can't take a whole lot of credit for it if it's not the pieces where I've taught students, but this is sort of the stuff where it's not just me, it's everybody else who does similar programming, who's involved in similar instruction. We're collectively doing this. Same with things like the stronger nonprofit and public sectors. We could look at things like when any to the state of the sector report, tells us about the strength and size of the nonprofit sector. More in quality, higher quality services. I think there's a great way of looking at that, but that's something that we could do research, we could track on. And that's the general approach, right? Is we want to think about how do we capture these? How do we pay attention to them? How do we reflect them? Any questions about how I did that? About how you might think about doing the same? Yeah, would you include colleagues in your department or school as a resource? And yeah, absolutely. Right, as I think about guest lecturers, the feedback I get from others. For instance, for our final class of the program, we have other faculty members sit in and evaluate presentations and performance. Did last night, and I'm going to do again tonight for my colleagues, right? So absolutely, right? And we can think about the same as sort of, colleagues at other institutions. Yeah, your community partners would be somebody you'd look at. And yeah, we'd want to identify them, build that into it. Even if we're not sharing it in the logic model we send for our application, in the initial one you build for yourself, you want to think about. So for instance, go back to this one. When I was thinking about my professional development, I'm also thinking about my colleagues who do similar work at other institutions and how we learn from each other. We attend conferences. I attend sessions where I might learn something really cool others have been doing to teach on the topic. We might share syllabi, we might share teaching materials with each other, recommend books. And so that's a piece of what we do is we do bring in that expert perspective from others. And that helps us improve our services, improve our, and that's an input we often don't recognize, right? This ability, sort of what we're getting from others. So can I quickly run through a layout for a random service organization? Yeah, we have time. Why don't we do that? I have a different version of the template. Let me see. And I'm going to use that one for this. So here we have a similar layout. We've got program inputs, program activities, and then program outputs. And then we have on the side program outcomes, measurable indicators, data sources, data collection methods. If somebody will propose a random program that none of you are doing, but that's close enough to be relevant to you. And the reason I'm asking that is because I don't want to pick a program one of you is doing, because I don't want you to use what I was thinking to answer it, because you have much better knowledge. And having me run through it with a program too close to what you're doing might make you think I'll be the expert on this. No, I can teach you how to, theoretically what a logic model is, but you are the ones that have the knowledge of how you actually achieve it and what you're trying to do. So a random service organization. Okay, yeah, summer feeding. I think would that work? Yeah. Okay, so we'll do summer feeding for this, right? So our program inputs, food, right? We're going to need food. We're going to need staff. We're going to need the logistics, right? So we're going to need, and we'll need to think about the staffing in multiple ways, right? Is we're probably thinking about prepping, cooking, right? Depending on whether it's hot or not, distribute, organize, communicate, right? We're going to think about all the things that we have to do to make that successful. We're going to think about, and I cannot spell today. Autocorrect is a lifesaver, right? Okay. Logistics, right? So are we going to need, transport either for the food or for the individuals, right? Are we going to need space, utilities, right? Are we going to need refrigeration? Let's do some fridges so I don't misspell that. Right, we're going to need that. Are there any other inputs that you think would be critical for us when we're thinking about a summer feeding program? Okay. The items listed in our inputs have to correspond horizontally with the other items in each column. No, because the way we think about inputs is they're probably going to be collective in that we bring all of these inputs together to provide the activities. Some of them might fit particular activities a little bit more closely. But what you'll notice here is the activities and the outputs look like they're set up where they're more likely to correlate pretty closely to each other. Right? When we think about sort of what that's going to be like, how that's going to function, those will look a little bit more clear. In terms of the other question about these templates, at the end of the session, I will have both of these worked examples available, and I will make the slides available. So I believe Annie has been posting it on the website where they have the materials. So you'll have actually all three of these available to you so that you can use them. Identifying clients for feeding. Okay. Yeah, so we can think about, okay, so identifying our clients, right? So yeah, we have communicate, but we might also think about sort of client recruitment and identification as a staffing need, right? Is we need to figure out who needs to be served. How are we going to approach that? Alternatively, if it's not coming from us, right, we might think about tech, and we might think about that as data, right? We might need sort of the schools to share data with us so that we know who we need to serve. We're probably going to need to think about IT and security, right? Is if we're going to be sharing or receiving information, a lot of that's protected. We need to make sure we have the systems, we have the protections in place for that to work. So then if we think about program activities, right, we might think about sort of meals prepared and meals served might actually be slightly different. So this might be things like pounds of food are often a measure that's used. And these are, right, in this case, if it's children, right, it's children fed. Right, and we're probably thinking about child meal, although I'll push you to be careful about sort of that as a good measure, right? It is sort of the individual at a time, sort of each service is probably a worse way of measuring and thinking about things than if we think about the individual being served, irrespective of how many times they've been served or how that works. So we'd want to think about something like that for it. Okay, yeah, so we'd also think, yeah, community, so the activities, right? And you're right, is we'd want to think about outreach, right? And that would be a critical activity, right? So outreach, it might be emails, flyers, meetings held, right? Whatever the case may be for sort of our form of outreach, but that's also a critical program activity and then an output of it. And you'll notice in this case, right, that outreach is sort of in something that has to happen first. Then you're planning the times, then you're doing the meal prepared, then you're doing the meals served, right? We might even be thinking about eating days or something like that, right? So, some I don't know how it would be labeled, but basically summer feeding events, right? And days held or right days operated, something of that sort. So we have a good feel of how frequently we're providing the food and providing this information. So what would be the type of short-term outcomes we'd want to see and we want to then try to measure? So in the short term, right, we want children fed, right, who wouldn't otherwise be. So here we might want to think about something like, you know, the percent of children that qualify for free or reduced meals that received meals from us, right? And so we might, in this case, we're probably pairing our counts, right? So our organizational data, right, from when we hold these events, compared to school or district data, right? And our collection method is going to be sort of how we collect this information. We can do this with sign-in food, right? Excellent, right? So yeah, we can use our tracking, sort of, you know, sign-in sheets, registration counts, whatever we're using, sort of how we track it. The other, right, is healthy food options in food deserts. Always have to be careful. I spell deserts and not desserts, right? Also not a healthy form. So yeah, here we're going to look at probably locations, right? Sort of percent of children living in food deserts with access, right, to our meals. So we're probably going to use some of the publicly available data on food deserts, right, on food deserts, and then we compare it to our data, right, our location data. So we're going to see here, right, days, and we probably say and locations, right, operated. So here we can see with these data sources, some of our program outputs allow us to feed into the data sources. So where we located, this will map onto looking at whether we're providing food options in food, right, healthy food options in food deserts, right? We can use our location data when we've served things. Again, some of this is going to be sort of forget the one that's really good about where food deserts are, but we can be using sort of publicly available, right? And we can be using our organizational data, right? So we're pairing those in this case. So then when we think about the intermediate, yeah, so we can use zip codes, right? Yeah, exactly. Or we can use census blocks, or sort of we can narrow it down further sometimes for what makes the most sense for how we're going to cover it. Because one of the challenges, if we use a zip code, it may not get whether this is actually in reach of everybody in that zip code or not, to be accessible easily. So then the intermediate outcome is we're really thinking about reducing food insecurity, right? This summer, right? In the summer, right? It's sort of, that would be the intermediate, and the longer term is sort of broader reductions in food insecurity, right? And we're probably also thinking about, if we're thinking about the intermediate or the long-term outcomes, we're probably also thinking about short-term student health or child health, right? Is health and development, right? Is adequate nutrition, healthy food, right? We know how critical that is in children growing, developing. So we want to think about that as an intermediate. And longer term is just generally sort of improve child health and nutrition. And again, we'd want to think about those measurable indicators, right? If you're citing other research for the long-term outcomes, would you make the claim in a citation or footnote? Yeah, I probably would, right? I'd probably have it somewhere. It may not be in the logic model. Maybe it's in your narrative. Maybe it's somewhere else. At the very least, you want to capture that for yourself first, and then see whether it makes sense to present it. So like here, yeah, when I were tinkering with this, if I had more time, I would actually go to there's a particular website I like that lays out where food deserts are. I'd probably throw in a hyperlink into here for my data collection, so I remember where I'm going to for it. And so if I share it with anybody else in our organization, they can go there as well, right? Maybe I might reference what specific form or app or spreadsheet, whatever that we're using for tracking here. So yeah, that's a great idea to track sort of not only generally what it's going to look like, but where you can go to for it, right? What we're going to use to make that work. Honestly, did I mix these two up? I might have swapped the data collection and data sources with what I was putting. Yeah, these are probably the support sources, and these are my collections. So yeah, I switched the two. So if we're thinking about reducing food insecurity in the summer, we're going to think about what our measurable indicators are. And that's, to some degree, it's similar to this short-term one. So this might be, maybe we make this individual level, maybe we make this community level. Child health and development, we might be looking at things like underweight or overweight children, right? Both of those can be signs of poor nutrition. So children, when they're weighed in, this might mean that maybe we're thinking about looking at community health, right? Public health or pediatricians, and sort of maybe generically getting counts of sort of how many fit into these categories or that are concerned about it probably wouldn't come directly to our organization. It would probably come to maybe a county agency or something. The long-term outcome be offering information to local government to further assess needs. Yeah, right. We could think about this sort of that providing information. And that may be sort of what we also think about, sort of how we use these. So if we're capturing this information, the other piece is not just we're capturing it, it tells us if we're successful or not, but it also gives us a tool to advocate, right? If we have really good information about, hey, we were able to serve this many children, but we weren't able to serve these children in these 3 communities because there wasn't funding available to serve all of them. Or there are this many students who we can't access and can't communicate with their family over the summer. And we have to find ways to make sure that there's better systems so that the transfer from being fed at school to being fed over the summer operates more smoothly. Or if there's a particular challenge in sort of nutrition or health outcomes that we're seeing, that we can bring that to attention. So absolutely, you want to use these as a tool to help yourself, but also to help the cause and help the community that you're serving. Right. And so our data collection methods are probably community level statistics, right? It's probably what we're thinking. We're not going into that category of tracking individuals. And again, this is probably at the community level, right? So we're going to think about sort of those stats. This is again, probably sort of not too far off compared to what we're looking at here, but it may be longer term, so over the entire summer. And then reductions in food insecurity, we're probably actually looking at whether there are reductions in the need, right? And so do we see sort of fewer students needing this in the future because we've done a better job of connecting them to it, we've advocated more for it, there's more attention about fixing the challenge of food deserts. And then same sort of, we're just looking generally at sort of different health outcomes for children and sort of growth and development. And all of those would be things we have. Again, these are probably not coming from us, right? This is probably going to be public or private sources, right? They're probably not coming from us, right? Maybe restricted sources, right? So sometimes sort of like health or other information, you have to get special approval to have access to, right? We might think of those as sort of our data sources. And this is probably by government agencies or researchers, right, are probably doing the data collection. We're probably not doing it ourselves. And that's what we have to recognize with a lot of these impacts and longer term outcomes. These are probably not things that we ourselves have the resources to capture. It's probably something that somebody else is going to study or capture, which is a problem because we don't have perfect access to what this should look like, how they're going to accomplish it, what that means. If they're getting the right metric for us, we may sometimes have to satisfy us with research that's close enough to what we're trying to accomplish. Any questions about either of those two worked examples and what that looks like? All right, thank you. I'm going to jump back into my slides then. So again, we'll share both of those. So now I just want to get you thinking about sort of how you get started. So it's sort of the first steps you'll take, and then what might be useful next steps. So the very first piece of advice I have is plan before acting. When we're doing a logic model, when we're thinking through this, we want to start by focusing on our most critical elements. What is it that we are most concerned with? What are we trying to accomplish here? What do we know about it? And then are there any missing pieces of knowledge? Are there things that we think might be helpful for us to understand our programs, understand what we're accomplishing that we're missing? The next step that can support you being able to put these logic models to use are to improve your own data collection. The most important key is to be consistent. So we want to make sure we're doing things in a similar way. So if 3 different frontline staff members are collecting the same information, they do so the same way. We capture all the same things. We haven't built out a form that's too convoluted that asks too many things, but we've made it sort of reasonable, workable, manageable, consistent. We want to make sure our data aligns with our needs. What you have to recognize with things like these logic models is you have a lot of agency over them. These tools are there for you to describe what you're trying to accomplish, what you need, how you do the work, what you're trying to do. And you want to make sure the data that feeds into this is data that's useful to your organization. The reality when dealing with funders is if you already have a sound proposal for the information you're going to capture and track and provide back, that gives you power that they may not ask for something different. If they don't already have something in mind, if there already isn't sort of a clear, easy thing that everybody's supposed to use, if, say it's a new funding entity that has just started and they're looking for ways to track information and measure it, the better quality what you're proposing is, the more likely they are to go with it. So making sure that the data you're capturing help you assess internally yourself whether you're happy with your programming is critical, right? You want to be learning from this first. Then you can think about what funders and others want. But the first piece, the most important piece, is does your organization learn from it? The other thing I would make an argument for, and I'd suggest really strongly, is think about data collection in terms of people focused. And what I mean by that is an individual. You are serving this one child 17 times this school year. Think about your reporting around that individual child, not those 17 interactions. Those 17 interactions could be a sub piece of what you're doing, but the more you make something people focused, the easier it is to set up all of the rest of this, to assess things sort of clearly, to understand what's going on, and to better think about how you're serving those clients as individuals rather than those clients as a person meal or somebody who showed up at this time to this session. It is really sort of starting with that person-focused, people-focused, individual-focused data collection. And then you haven't heard me say it enough. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a professor and an educator, right? But we really want to focus on learning. If this is not an opportunity for you to think about, what do I want to change about this? Am I satisfied with things? What do I need to know about this? How can I understand if the organization if the program is working well enough, if there are things we can learn from peers, if there are things we can do inside, if I can use this as leverage to make a change I've known we needed to make for a decade and we haven't been in position to make that change. We really want to think about using these efforts to focus on how our organization can run. Because I mean, that's the reality. That's what I tell my students when they come in to my courses. Most of them are already working, right? They're mid-career. The reality is your work requires so much of you. It's hard to carve off time to reflect and to think about sort of what you need to do differently, what we can learn from, what we can change. Having to go through a process like this of building a logic model in order to get a grant application in is a way to carve off time for yourself to do that reflection and do that learning in your organization. So a little bit more thinking about data collection. First, build it into what you're already doing. It is always cheaper and easier to collect information at the time you're already doing things or even before it. It is much more work and more expensive to collect information after the fact. You probably have to do both, right? That's a reality, is you're probably still going to have to do some degree of contact collecting information after the fact. But as much as possible of your data collection, you want to be collecting when it is happening or even before it. Anything that shows up as an output needs to be collected at the time or before the time of providing your services. If you're collecting it before, you're probably just going to verify that everybody that pre-registered participated or which of them didn't, that type of thing. But you really want to make sure that we're building it in, so we're collecting this information now. Anything we have to go back and collect later is going to be inefficient and difficult. All right, so the better we collect this, the earlier we collect it, building this into things is going to be more critical and more helpful. The second, or third, I guess, big piece of advice is use simple technology. Don't get too complicated, right? Don't outthink it, don't overthink it. Find a piece of technology that works for you. Is it just a spreadsheet? Is it a simple database through something like Access? Are you using apps that are available, like quick and easy Qualtrics surveys for registration and for surveying people after the fact, right? Think through sort of what makes the most sense for your organization, and use something that the people you need to be using can access it, and that the people who need to do the analysis can use it to conduct the analysis. It probably does not mean that you have to pay for some expensive software, right? Sort of think if there's a system out there that already works better and easier. Sometimes the better, more expensive option actually isn't. And so just thinking about sort of what works most effectively for you. Related to that, kill for your trees. If you can, make sign-in sheets digital, right? Make sort of any of those things that you would track on paper done digitally on a tablet or on a device, quicker and easier. It will save you a lot of time. Trying to take stuff that had once been paper and turn it back into something electronic that you can keep elsewhere is a very slow, very intensive challenge and problem when you're trying to make that work. The other thing I would say is carve out and keep spaces for qualitative or narrative information. Is if you were building a custom spreadsheet or database that allows you to keep information there, just make sure you've left a few blocks of space where you can keep stories about things, right? Where you can jot down notes about what's important, where you can share, if somebody is sharing back information that's useful to your organization, keeping space for that. That means if you're doing a survey of people, it's always good to leave open-ended questions at the end, right? A few places where people can share a little bit more. For instance, if we go back to my first worked example, when I get my teaching evaluations, I barely pay attention to like the numerical things that students rate me on. I pay attention to what they wrote because the open-ended questions tell me more. And if we're thinking about learning, those open-ended places for information is probably going to tell you more. It's also the type of thing donors love, right? I mean, fundraisers know this, right? Donors don't care about stats, they care about stories, right? It is individuals, like the sort of individual stories, the individual narratives, the individual outcomes, those are the things that sell to them. And the tricky thing to realize is even though institutional funders also ask for data and they want tracking and everything else, when it comes to program narratives, when it comes to explaining what you do, that human nature in those institutional funders also wants to hear the narratives, right? Wants to hear the success stories, how you get there, how this works. And again, individuals just serve as a better unit of analysis than interactions and services. And that's in part because this allows you to do that. You can have both like the narratives of how somebody succeeded, what they did with their life, and then you can use that to convert that into quantifiable things. Okay, so we've heard back from alum from our program. This person was valedictorian, this person went on to college, this person got a scholarship, this person has a job doing this. And we can go back and we can quantify each of those things about their story and use that to count sort of how many people have gone through our services, have reached this outcome, have had this, success that we can recognize or think about. I didn't throw it here, but the other one that I always push people to think about is recognize that failure exists, it happens, and it's critical for us to learn. I learn far more from my own failures than I do from my successes. I actually use some of my failures when I was working as teaching points to get things across when I'm teaching classes. I learn more when I get a research article rejected than I do when I get it accepted. I learn more about how I can improve my teaching when a student is struggling than when they're finding the class easy and succeeding. So this is another piece of this data collection is we can't just capture success stories. We want to also make sure we're capturing where it didn't work and use that as part of our learning and what we build into it. So next steps for sort of, okay, you've done the basics, you're happier with your data collection. What do you do next? Well, one thing is you do what you're already doing here, right? Take advantage of capacity building opportunities, right? NE has these workshops for CSC programming, has their own other capacity building programs for members and non-members alike. UPHS has its conference, has a few other training opportunities. The SQ school occasionally, like I'm doing now, will host workshops helping, partnering with others. We'll probably be doing some for the other local human service funding with the CHSP. We also do have master's students who do applied research projects for their courses. So there are opportunities to do capacity building that happen where professors are supervising master's students doing work on programs. So looking at opportunities that are out there, there are probably more of them than you realize. And I may be biased, but I think that we tend to do a better job than consultants. So if you're going to people who actually understand the nonprofit sector, if you're going to any or UPHS for help on it, they know what you're going through, right? They know what you're trying to accomplish. You're going through master's students who are, in the peak of what they're learning. We're probably going to have something that's a little bit more relevant and applied. In terms of internships, our master's students are almost all now in service already. So we used to have a lot of students who were still sort of coming right out of undergrad and looking for internships. We're probably down to fewer than 10% of our students who are considering internships at this point. So it's probably best, I would say, use the career services at FSU and at FAMU and TCC. They'll be much better at sort of posting and advertising internships that get across everybody. And then get across all of the programs. We just now have so few. We had to drop our internship course because we had so few students sort of needing that as a requirement and looking for it. But I would say sort of, advertise more openly with that, and then use like Volunteer Leon and others as well. Yeah, exactly. College of Social Work has a lot more. Because they have both an undergraduate and a graduate program, and their graduate program requires it's called the practicum, I believe. But sort of much more advanced, engaged versions of internships. Whereas, again, I probably will have 5 students a year in my program that are looking for internships out of maybe 10 at the most. And a lot of them are probably looking for funded internships. So they're applying for like the legislative and gubernatorial fellowships and other things of that sort. But if you're looking for one-off projects that cover a semester, our students are excellent for that. Because you're getting people who are out there doing real work, who understand what they're doing. They're sort of being able to bring these multiple pieces of information to you. The other is identify an evidence base if there's one for your programs. There are things like clearinghouses and other research-based models. What you would do with those is you'd look at the programs that you're offering and you'd search them to see what the evidence base is for them. There's going to be an entire upcoming training that'll get into more detail about those. But that's something you can also use, right? When you're thinking about those long-term outcomes or those impacts, you might look at this existing evidence base for what's out there, right? These clearinghouses, what's available. There's a learning curve to those, just like anything else, but it's probably easier than the learning curve of figuring out how to use, say, Google Scholar for yourself and how to read all the research that's out there and get enough access to it. Which probably means going to the library, either the public one or one of the university ones, so you can actually get access to articles. Because most of the research that faculty do ends up closed off because of the weird publication business model of how that research is done. But these clearinghouses have done the work for you, right? They've captured all this, brought it together, put it in there. I have some links at the end of the slideshow for some of those resources that are available that you could always use. The other thing is think about unifying your data collection and analysis processes. And what I mean by this is don't design it to just work for one purpose. So if we're doing our data collection, if we're analyzing it, it can't just be so that we respond to our funder for this grant program. We want to make sure that it works for everything, right? We can use our data collection for our programming to figure out how we're doing, what we can improve, who we need to follow up on. We can use it for reporting back, right? Whether it's reports that are regulatory in nature or to funders, that it can feed into the communications we do, whether that's with the clients we serve, the community we're in, the alumni of our program, the broader community, even sort of how it feeds into our fundraising needs. So when we're designing these, when we're building this, make sure we're thinking about all the needs and that we don't have separate systems for each of these. Because the more separate systems we have for things, the more unnecessary complications we've built into it. And the last is think about building building the capacity or partnering to obtain the capacity to do program evaluations. So if there isn't an evidence base, if we're not sure how effective our programs are, if we want to be more competitive for funding by being able to point to how effective our work is, a program evaluation is sort of the optimal way of doing that. It costs resources, it costs effort, it costs money. But my own research on program evaluations and nonprofits has actually found that the culture of the organization is more important. As you probably all know, nonprofits are experts at getting things done without really enough resources to do what you do. The reality is, if we look at most of what you accomplish at your organizations, you're doing far more than we would expect with the resources you have available to you. The same thing is true for any of this about performance management, program evaluation, building out all of those different pieces. It can happen as well on sort of a relatively small, manageable scale. So the basics about evaluation. So an evaluation is where you formally are analyzing what you do as a program. The advantage is it builds out some transparency for you. It gives you some answerability or justification for your programs, right? If we know our impact, if we know our outcomes much better, we're going to be much more confident in being able to share that, being able to compete for resources. It allows us to comply with things that are in place. It allows us to enforce what we're trying to accomplish. The disadvantages, of course, are the costs, both money and resources. Some funders will require some form of program evaluation, but typically won't pay for it. An evaluation is usually going to focus on things that are most measurable. So the more that you care about outcomes that are more difficult to measure, aren't easy to count, the less attention that will get paid to them. One downside is it's pretty easy to fall into sort of a cost-benefit mindset where you're using economic values of everything, right? Everything has to have a dollar sign attached to it. That may not be a good fit for the type of work you're doing. The other thing is evaluations also sort of tend to fit into the existing power dynamics and politics of your organization. I don't mean politics like politically right, Democrats, Republican. I'm much more thinking sort of the internal politics of your organization. Those who make decisions, those who make power, they're probably going to already shape what the evaluation focuses on. If we're concerned about a dynamic where maybe we're paying attention to the wrong constituency or serving things in the wrong way, an evaluation is not going to help you overcome that. It's much more going to align with the existing way that we serve people about how we identify who we're going to prioritize and how we accomplish the work. But if you think about an evaluation, the process is you really start by preparing for it, assessing your capacity, trying to build it up, thinking about the purpose, getting buy-in from key stakeholders, having clear goals. And I always add sort of question your assumptions. We want to make sure if we're doing an evaluation that we're not doing it to confirm what we already know, but that we're really open to learning. Then we can think about two different approaches to it. The objective scientist approach is where it's quantitative, it's an evaluation of the outcome of our work. It's usually conducted by outsiders, but we may be concerned with evaluations that help us improve the service. And that's called a utilization-focused evaluation. It's formative, it happens during the process. We're usually using both sort of narrative or qualitative information and those things that are quantifiable or measurable. Usually it's going to be run by those in your organization. We use the theory of change in the logic model to help us conduct evaluations. They're the scaffolding that allow you to do the evaluation. So if you built out a logic model, that's what you're going to test with an evaluation. You're going to take that logic model and test whether it's happening. We want to specify our goals, right? What are the outcomes, the impacts, the activities, bridging goals, what type of data? So we've probably already done a lot of this in our logic model. And then we would analyze that data and then present the results. So as I said, I've got links here. You'll have them available for some of these evidence-based programs. So with that, I want to first open up for some questions and then maybe start brainstorming sort of where you go, how you start these logic models for yourself. So if there are any questions about any of this? Yeah. So I've thrown a lot at you. So just maybe using the reactions, something like that. If you could throw a thumb up, thumbs up, or a wave or anything of the sort, if you already feel comfortable with the first piece, right? If you already have a clear idea of what the inputs you have available to you and that you need from others to make your program successful. All right. I'm not even going to ask about activities because I'm going to work with the running assumption that you already know what activities you're going to provide. But do you already have a good feel for the outputs that you would have for your program? How many of you sort of feel comfortable with that? That's something you probably would be able to answer pretty quickly and easily. Okay, couple of you. And then the harder ones are, of course, going to be the outcomes and the impacts. And so when you're doing this, I would say the most important starting point is to get that short-term stretch right. So the inputs, yeah, you're probably going to miss some, right? When I put down my list, when I brainstorm what I needed, there are things that go into it that I'm going to overlook because I'm taking them for granted or I assume they're going to be there. So the inputs, they might not be perfectly there, but you're going to capture the most meaningful ones pretty easily. That's probably not a big worry. The same with the activities. But going to the outputs and then the short-term outcomes, you want to spend your most time on those two. You really want to get those right because they're the framework for the rest of it to work. So that's where I would place your most attention first, is to get those two things right. So really, how do we capture whether this is working, how this functions, and then how do we see in that short-term follow-up period whether this is working? So I would emphasize those first, move to them first, and then move on to the longer term, so the medium and the long-term outcomes or impacts. But really start with those. Yeah, hardest for me is always proving it works because it's years before clients know. And yeah, so what I would say is the way to start with that is really think, just like you would do as yourself, right? What are some of those easy victories you can look for? What are the markers that you're making progress, even if you're not all the way there? So yeah, if you can't tell if it's fully succeeded for a client because it'll take years, what are the things that would tell you, oh, I think they're on the right track, right? Or I think this is having an impact and it's working. And so those would be the things that we would look for, right? So yeah, I mean, when I ran the feeding children, right? Sort of thinking about that summer feeding, we'd look for things like, are the kids coming back? And if they're not, why not, right? What's going on here? As that short-term thing, it's not going to get us to those health outcomes, but it's going to be an indicator of those easy victories or sort of the steps we need along the way. It may also be sort of, maybe there's less food waste because they're eating the healthy food, right? And they're getting used to eating the healthy food, right? So we may look for things that may be sometimes not quite super intuitive, but that also signal to us that this is working and this is making sense. Right? Is we want to really look at those things, right? And yeah, that's why we need those short-term outcomes as well, right? Is they have to be present. What other questions or what other challenges do you see when you're trying to think about these outcomes and what you're trying to achieve and how you get there through the work that you're accomplishing? Well, then let me throw that question back to you. So as Kelly mentioned in the chat, sort of the challenge of proving it works because it's years before the clients know if it works. What do the rest of you do to identify those important steps along the way, or how you know people are making progress, even if we haven't gotten to a success state yet? Okay. Yeah, so that's even harder, right? That proving something didn't happen is a difficult one. Although I guess, we could be tracking that of, for each of our clients, if we haven't reported a negative outcome for them, that's progress, right? That's a small victory. It's not sort of the larger victory you're looking for of being able to demonstrate that it worked, but sort of even just this not happening is a good sign, right? And yeah, so we could track sort of if people are not coming back to us again for services, right? Is that going to be progress for some of our organizations, right? If we think about a lot of our causes, theoretically, our longest term impact is to put ourselves out of business. We probably can't because there's so many other societal challenges and forces that shape that. But that's our goal for most of our programs, right? Is we want to make this need go away. We want to make sure that nobody's being abused, that we don't have people living in food deserts and facing food insecurity. We want to make sure, for a lot of our services, right, they're things that we want to end. And yeah, looking for those little measurable sort of impacts along the way are a critical way of doing so, making that work. Any other ways that you capture those little victories and sort of mark progress along the way? Yeah, attendance and retention in programs, right? Yeah, and that's it. Because what you're going to do, and that's really how you're moving from those outputs to outcomes, the short-term outcomes. The outputs, we're going to capture who's attending, right? For outcomes, we may want to pay attention to retention, right? So who keeps coming back? How many of our people keep coming back, right? Do they keep participating in the program? And that's one of those short-term outcomes. It doesn't prove that we've changed things for them, but it gives us a pretty strong indicator that they're satisfied with our work, that they feel it's worth their time. And honestly, that's a better signal probably than a survey response. Is if somebody believes something is worth their time and they keep coming back to it, that is a much stronger signal than if they write that they're happy with something on a survey. Because it's telling us that they're putting the most valuable thing they have, their time, into taking advantage of your services and coming back for it. Anything else that you use to capture those short-term sort of markers of progress and small victories? So I'll look at silly little things like I actually notice and pay attention if somebody has taken multiple classes with me. That's a victory, right? I'm saying that they came back for another round, right? They dealt with the whole semester with me and they still came back, right? That's usually a good sign for me, right? Sometimes it's not a good sign, right? If you have an organization serving somebody who came to you in a crisis, you're hopeful that they're not coming back, right? So we want to think about that. And that's where that theory of change is helpful, right? We're understanding sort of how we make progress and what that looks like. It's separate, it's distinct from the logic model, but it can help feed into your logic model and understand it a little bit better too. Anything else that you see as particularly challenging for this? What other sort of key challenges do you face in trying to think through and develop your logic models? All right. An education workshop can't follow up afterwards, only reactions at the time. Yeah, depend on our community partner and something that we can control. Yeah, so we have two very similar challenges, right? That challenge of what room do we have for follow-up, right? And that's what we want to be thinking about. And as you saw, when I was doing the worked examples, when I talked about the long-term impacts or the long-term outcomes, I did not presume that this would be something that I could measure. And you may have to do the same for some of your outcomes, whether it's medium-term or long-term outcomes. Some of them are going to be things that you cannot capture, you can't do yourself, right? Either you may not be allowed to, right? If we're talking about education, we might not have contact information for everybody. We may sort of sometimes in health and education related fields, some services, right? We have restrictions about information about people, following up on them, protecting the identities of those we serve. So yeah, we may not have our ability to follow up much beyond their immediate reaction or response. We can do minor things, right? It is sort of, if you can't reach out to them, leaving them with materials and contact information with the hope of them following up, having possibilities for social media engagement or other engagement with, alum of your programs can be a way. It's not going to be great. I'm not going to, I wouldn't have a great deal of confidence in it. But again, it's an indicator of something, right? People who've signed up, who are supporters. some of our outcomes will depend on our community partner. And that's where, can we find a way to work with the partners a little bit better, right? Ask what they're doing to capture information, talk through sort of how you can help one another by sharing information better. If there are things that they would benefit from learning from you, if there are things you would benefit from learning from them, that can be a useful way of getting access to information you wouldn't have already. For example, the summer feeding one that your group suggested to me, if there isn't good communication with the schools, it's not going to work, right? If we don't have a way of knowing who needs to be served, how we can serve them, how we can reach them, it's not, it'll fall apart, right? Even before we get to the evaluation and sort of tracking the outcomes, just even providing the services needs that. The other challenge, using it and reviewing it, much like a SWOT analysis, right? It's an exercise, right? SWOT, the strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats, is sort of one of those recommended ways to analyze your strategy and think through your programs and how they work. And they're really helpful in breaking apart and putting things there. And then sort of that next step of how do we learn from it is a challenge, right? And with something like the logic model, in terms of how I might use it for learning in terms of an organization, I sometimes find the easier way to deal with just about everything is just treat it like a traffic light. Like if I went through my logic model and I highlighted in green everything I'm perfectly happy with, right? This is in great shape. We have access to information. We've captured it easy. We're happy with where we're going with it. Maybe the things I've got some uncertainty about, I'll throw in yellow. More uncertainty, maybe I'll go orange and then red for the things that are a real problem. And then I'll focus on those things that are in those colors, right? Is there something I can fix? Is it something I can't fix? Maybe I'll even have maybe the reds are the ones I can't fix. In the oranges, maybe I can fix it or I can do something about. But sort of using that logic model to identify what can I change, what do I need to change? And doing something simple like that, it depends on how you think, right? So sometimes sort of that visual approach, using color, simplifying it, allows you to think about that. Sometimes talking it through, right? For some people that think well by talking, having a conversation with your colleagues about it, right? It's not probably the best way of developing the logic models. Yes, we send it off to people to give their input, figure out the pieces, fill it out themselves. It's probably more effective use of time than sitting everybody together and collectively coming up with it. But then after we have it, it's probably worth having a short meeting about, right? What do we understand from this? What do we learn from this? What do we need to fix about it before we use it? And it may be something, present it to the board, right? There may be ideas they come up with, or it may illustrate to them, hey, maybe you need to help commit a little bit more resources to help make this happen, right? Is thinking about using this as a tool for communication internally as well, is a way to use it and to review it a little bit more. Any other challenges that you face? And I would say, related to that, using it internally, that may also make you value this exercise more, right? I remember from my times of applying for grants and even some of the stuff I still have to do internally, there's a lot of people who ask for information where the information is not useful to me, right? It doesn't help me do what I'm doing better. It doesn't serve my constituency, my clients better. And so there's no point to it. And it would be easy to make that same assumption of a logic model because it's something being asked of when you're applying for a grant. But if you can be proactive in identifying sort of, I have to do this exercise anyway, how can I use it to help with my organizational learning? How can I use it to be something that allows us to sell what we're doing better, to understand what we're doing better, to make marginal improvements to things? That would be something I'd argue you want to be using this for as well. So what would you say is the stage you're struggling with the most? So if you were to look at that logic model now and you try to put it together for your organization, your program, what's the step you view as the first hardest step for you to figure out? Like which stage would you be struggling with the most if you tried to do it right now? All right, so data collection. Yeah, and so that's why I made sure I had that separate slide about thinking about data collection and how we track it. And we want to think about and then outcomes for the long term. Okay, so both of those make sense. In a way, they're actually related, right? So the data collection is, how do we actually do this? And my suggestion with the data collection is fill the rest of it out first, right? Come up with what you'd want to capture. And then see, is this something we have available to us? Is this something that makes sense for us to track? Is it not? If you end up with slightly overly ambitious outcomes or outputs, and you have to scale them back to what's achievable, that's reasonable, right? And that's what we would want to do and sort of make that function. The long-term outcomes, and that's related to that absolute proof that it works. It is, again, you probably can't do either of those yourself. With long-term outcomes, with long-term impacts, with the absolute proof that a program works, you may be able to capture that for the individual served and assess if you can follow up with them, if you can track their outcomes, you may be able to figure out of those who you can keep paying attention to, this is how many are succeeding in life or succeeding in whatever measure makes the most sense. How much you can attribute one program to, that's difficult, right? Because there's so many other things that happen. And that's where something like the theory of change helps you get there. You can use that though, right? Is if you're consistently tracking the narratives of people who've gone through your programs, you can tell about who has succeeded after this program, how have they succeeded, and perhaps if you're in contact with them, communication with them, their own thoughts on how the program benefited them and how it worked for them. The key is if we're consistently tracking it, it allows that to move from anecdotes to data. Right, and that's the key. And that's why I said when you're thinking about data collection, carving off a space for narrative or qualitative information, that's how you move from anecdotes to data is you capture enough of those stories. Right, it's not necessarily statistically significant. It's not going to meet some of the other markers that, like, say, the evidence clearinghouses would look for, but it's going to give you enough stories where you will see common themes. You will understand that this is what seems to work for those who are succeeding after our program. And the reality is we'll never get absolute proof that anything works, right? There's always going to be unknowns. There's always going to be errors. The people who at least succeeded for are going to be the hardest for us to find information about, right? There's those that we lose touch with, those that we can't reach, those who we don't have contact with information with are going to include a lot of those for whom it just didn't work. Whether because they weren't in a position to take advantage of it, whether everything else that was necessary for success wasn't available for them. A lot of things well outside our control and probably outside their own personal control even. We can also, though, rely on those other sources, right? The clearinghouses, systematic reviews of literature, those can give us confidence that programs similar to ours work. Again, it's not absolute proof for ours, but it does give you some indicators that this is what we see working for others. And the more details overlap between ours, right? If we're hitting all the main points of how a program is provided that has this evidence base, we can be pretty confident that it's working, especially if we have other things like, are the clients that we're serving close enough? Does that make enough sense for it? Things like that can help us to make that work. And I would say, sort of, if you're pushing yourself for thinking about what you're trying to achieve here, I would say absolute proof is absolutely not what you're pushing for. You do just want to think about more evidence, better evidence, right? The idea is always better, not best, right? We're never going to get to best. We're never going to get to absolute. But if we have better information, better confidence, more information, that's going to help us to make a stronger case. What else? Remaining challenges, other things can I answer for you? Well, if there are no others, or if you just don't want to ask it in front of a larger group, I can go ahead and end the formal workshop now. Again, I will share the slides and I will share those 2 worked examples we did, and we'll make those available. If you are interested in sort of talking through any ways we can help you build your capacity at the ASCU school, especially sort of, it's primarily through student-run projects as part of a class or a capstone. Please feel free to reach out to me. My information is at the here as well, is on the slides as well. If you're interested in either our certificate program in civic and nonprofit leadership, or our master's program, or even our doctoral program, please feel free to reach out to me as well. I actually right now direct all three of those. So I am your primary contact for any of them. So again, yeah, please feel free at any time to reach out if there's anything else I can do. And I hope you all continued success on the great work that you are all doing, and the way that you're helping the children in our community and the rest of our community as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Berlin. We appreciate your time, and we will post all of your materials on our website so that others who weren't able to attend today can benefit from them, and others, the ones who did attend, can look back and review everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.